There was once a man and a friend called Buffer and Rush. And they found, while hunting in the woods one day, underground, they found a very large suppository of gold. Now, they were very excited, and they mined the gold. They went inside and they took the gold out. Now, once they had taken the gold out, they thought immediately, like anybody does, we're going to be millionaires. Big, cheesy grin. Now, in actual fact, what happened is when they went from the ground, they took it back in their bag marked swag, and they spoke to their customers and people at the marketplace, and basically they said, well, do you want to buy this lump of gold? And everyone looked at them a bit confused. They didn't quite realize what they were trying to sell. I mean, after all, who really wants some gold that you can't really do anything with? It looks a little bit like just a random stone. So yes, somebody was like, oh, I'll take it. But they didn't realize that the valuable resource that they had found over here, they needed to package it in a way that people wanted it, so that there was a demand for their gigantic supply over here. So they thought about it, they got a bit sad and went to a pub and had a beer. And then the barman handed them a beer, and he was wearing, on the end of his finger, that's his hand, and on his little pinky was a gold ring. And they thought, what if we did that? What if we made a gold ring? A gold ring that people wanted to wear. So then they got very excited about this. They went and found a mold, a blacksmith, to make them a printout mold that they could mold the ring here a little bit. And they poured their gold in, took it out the furnace, and they had a ring. And they made their first collection of rings. And then when they went back to here, suddenly everybody was like, I want that. Yes, please take my money. And Buffer and Rush were very happy. So what happened after that? So they had found their value in the ground, they dug it up, and then they had gone over and they had to go back and forth a little bit, but they had validated their offer. They had found that maybe they didn't want it in lumps and bumps, but they wanted it in something that solved a problem. At the time, people wanted to have affordable jewelry that looked very cool and gave them status and allowed them to look sexy. And Buffer and Rush facilitated that transition. Now, they had only currently served a small amount of people. So let's say they did 20 people. It was people who came by their market store, people they knew, friends and family, and that kind of thing. But what they actually wanted to do is they wanted to serve more people. But people didn't know who they were. So what they did was they started to, for every happy customer, they would get them to write a little nice note that said what they liked, what was good, and then to give them a rating. Once they'd done that, they did that for every single customer. Once they'd done that, over time, they built up a stack of proof and evidence to show that what they were selling was really good. And what they did was they just ran little ads in newspapers, and they created little posters, and they had it on the side of their wagon. They just had their rating and the person. It was a small town back then, so everyone sort of knew who they were and how good and how satisfied they was. And then when they ran an ad, they would talk about the ring, and they would talk about what it allowed them to do and the benefits and outcomes and how well it would go with their outfit. And then they would just talk about all of the happy customers. So essentially, if people wanted to find them, they became almost the go-to guys in town. If you thought about gold rings, you would think about Buffer and Rush, and they essentially became the guys. So that whenever anyone thought, I want to go and buy a ring, they thought that in their little brain, they would go, ooh, I'm going to go to Buffer and Rush. And eventually, what they did, they had all of those ideas. They decided to open up their store. So they opened up a store and they called it Goldfinger. And in there, you could imagine what it looked like inside. Was just walls of not too many, every single thing they sold. So they made each one look really nice and really good. And they would stand in the middle and they would just talk them through. And then there would be sizes and so on and so forth. And people would queue because there was only the two of them at the moment. So they could only do a certain amount of people, and the queues went round the corner on forever because they did have an element of scarcity because they couldn't do what they needed to do, which was if they had gone out of fashion or if they had wanted to scale. I mean, Buffer had ideas of making a new store, and Rush had ideas of making a big impact on the world. And currently, it was just those two people, and maybe they had a little guy occasionally out back who was doing some of the smelting and making the rings, but ultimately they were bound by the amount of people that they could make. So they had to understand how the cost of the value that they provided and the price people were willing to pay for it, and then if they were going to be any good at it at scale. So they thought long and hard about how we could make this faster, what we could do. So they did things like originally all they had was a wheelbarrow that they were taking to the quarry to get all the gold, and they were walking that back into town. Well, they'd sold enough rings to upgrade that to a small little donkey. Let's see what this donkey looks like. More of an elephant. Okay, so they bought an elephant, and instead the elephant was allowed, rather than a donkey, they'd sold out of donkeys, was allowed them to bring a lot more gold. They could, in essence, pile the gold all there, and then it could also get rid of that, and this could turn into a big wagon that could be taught, and there could be multiple ones of them. So they would pull in all their gold, which meant they had more supply. So in here, they were hard at work farming it and bringing it in. And then here, they were dragging it. So they had an end-to-end supply. They could increase that. And then what they did is they tried to break it down, every single process. So originally, it was very much like they did this, then they did this, then they went here. They saw that guy about this, they saw that guy about that. And it was quite confusing to get a ring. They had to go over here to get over here. And it was a bit illogical. And what they did is they broke it down into very simple steps. As simple as dig, collect, deliver, melt, press, polish, box, label, deliver to store, and so on. And they broke down every single step and tried to find either people that could do it for them or ways in which they could use the technology at the time to help them. And over time, they began to be quite predictable. Here, if Rush got a little bit drunk or Buffer got a little bit sick, the amount of rings they would make would go down because there was only the two of them. Here, they were a lot more predictable at making a profit. And that really helped them see the future and plan what they wanted to do. So the good thing about that is so far we had value, they validated that value, and then what they did is they wanted to become almost the verified guys. And they did that by getting a lot of eyeballs on it. So what they did is they made themselves very visible in the market. So lots of people could see them. Lots of people knew what was going on. And eyeballs everywhere. Eyeballs everywhere. And then after that, what they tried to do is they wanted to get viable. And this took time. This took a couple of years to understand how to break down into a simple, continuous, unbroken chain. They had to hire a few people that knew what to do. They had to try and almost make it so that they didn't have to do a lot and they could just focus on building Goldfinger the empire. Now, what they did after a while, once they had a profitable business, they realized that if they, when they were in their ads and when they were going to see rich, wealthy people who weirdly wore wigs and talk to them and be like, hey, do you want to buy a ring? What they realized that is if they use a certain type of talking, if they use a certain type of verbal language, they were able to charge a premium. So if they told a story, so rather than talking about the utility of being cool and how that would maybe make a girl want to hang out, let you buy a girl a drink, or for to look good at the ball, they decided, what if this gold had a story and it came from a very, very weird place, and that only they had found it, and it was very rare, and that certain colours, so sometimes it looked a little bit like Welsh gold, even though they were nowhere near Wales. And they could tell little stories that allowed them to increase the price. There was almost a direct correlation with the language they used and the price that they could charge. And there was almost a romance in how they communicated and they connected with their audience. And they would change the story depending on who they were talking to. So if they were talking to people who were very hip and on trend, they might talk about how it went really well with the suit when you were at the ball, and that when they were going to their posh dinner, how their boss would see that they had this posh ring and know that he was a successful man and things would happen in their favor. And in other formats, when they would maybe go to people who were more, let's say, mercenaries or people who were in the army, they would talk about how if all of them got the same ring, they would have a brotherhood and they would be able to have a shield and everyone had a ring. And maybe they would even have a round table at some point, who knows? And then when they would talk to family members, what they would do is maybe say that, what if your family, so mom, dad, baby, and baby, what if all of you guys came together and you all had a little family ring? And then they realized that on top of that, if they could have a level of customization, so they were telling a story and they were doing it in a lovely way. And maybe if they could make it slightly personalized, so maybe you had a ring here and you had a little ring here, maybe they could do it in shape. Maybe they could do it in what they could etch into it. They found a guy, oh, that's weird. They found a guy who was able to etch things into it. They found little bits here. And then they ended up creating a catalogue of what people could have. And they even charged a premium. Some people really wanted to just own this for their family. So then they would literally take, if they had a catalogue of all the things they would do, they would literally take that page out and burn it so that no one else could choose this particular ring face that they had. So then they developed a relationship, almost a retainer. Every child that this family had, they would come and get a ring. So there was a nice little relationship there that happened. And then they realized that they had all these lovely stories, and the way they verbally spoke about it, they could now articulate that in lovely paintings of, people at war and winning as a brotherhood, and they would have their little ring as a little signet. And then people at Christmas, all around the dinner table having dinner, all pointing their rings at each other, um, to show in a sign of solidarity and love. And those stories, paired with that visual language, allowed them to do things that they weren't maybe necessarily able to do when they just had a viable business, where it was very much about inputs and outputs. This was a lot more about emotion and storytelling. Really important, but at the right time. Now, this, after a while, they did this, and Buffer, he just wanted to keep doing this. He liked the idea that they got money to invest and live their life. It was almost a bit of a cash cow, and it just printed what they want, whatever they wanted, they could do. And he wanted a good life. He wanted to have a family and just keep going. Rush, however, now he had ideas of status. Some might even say, after a few pints, that he had a little bit of delusions of grandeur. That he wanted to hang out with royalty and wanted to fraternize with the top people. He wanted kings to wear his jewelry. He wanted to expand the range into scepters, into swords, into all kinds of things, shields, and anything and everything in between, which would make him money, but also make him famous and have a legacy. And Buffer and Rush really disagreed with this. Buffer wanted to keep it going, and they actually broke apart. And Rush bought Buffer out, and Buffer went off to go and do a very similar thing, but at his own pace, just for the love of the craft. And Rush kept going, and he kept expanding. He kept building and building and building and building and growing. And then what happened is because he really wanted to align with the views of the kingdom, and he wanted to be seen as courageous. So he tried to outfit all of the king's army with not just rings, but entirely gilded gold. So their entire armor was gold trimmed and gold this and gold that. And he kept going, and he gilded all the things. All the thrones had his stuff, and he was authenticated by the king, and the king really liked it. And then what happened is that the king said that he could only work with him. And that was very sad. But the problem is the reason why he could only work with him is because essentially he had become so so synonymous and ubiquitous with the king, that everybody else had sort of kind of gone off him. It was no longer the cool, edgy brand over here. It was sort of the thing that was everywhere in all different versions, in all different ways. And unless Rush was fulfilling the orders of the king, because he sort of had to, because that was his bread and butter, and the enterprise, the empire, really wanted him to kind of make sure that he did everything he wanted to. So he was sort of in lockstep with his customer, let's say. But instead of going, he could no longer go back, because other people, let's say his upward trajectory, other people had come in here. And you had lots of independent indie gold things. And what they were doing completely innovative things, like one company, for instance, had taken the gold and they'd put a gem in the middle of it. And the other one had done a diamond and a diamond and a gem on a gold band. And people were starting to use some of these for ceremonies, and stories were being told for love and for death and for success. And unfortunately, Rush realized that he was sort of almost becoming a bit of a commodity, that he needed the king more than the king needed him. So he just would cheapen the gold cut, so it became some things were gold plated. And then over time, he was working at mass. The process sort of went a bit downhill, and no one really cared about it. And Goldfinger as a brand didn't really become much, and everyone sort of forgot about it. But because the industry had popped up, lots of companies continued to go. And because Rush had chosen certain virtues that he wanted to align himself with, they had worked in a way, but they hadn't always worked. And some of the campaigns that they had ran hadn't gone well because was the king a good man? Yeah, but was he as good as some of the brotherhoods and the aspirational side of things over here that they had aligned with in the early days, rather than almost the gov power and the dominance over here before these characters were seen as noble and the customer base wanted to be like them. So when they saw them, these people could relate to this imagery, they could relate to these emotional stories. They couldn't really relate to this area. And unfortunately, the only way to do that was to hike the price up, which made it a very premium. And unfortunately, because it lacked story and it was only a price, eventually it ended.